Look at some of the more outspoken people. They're immediately reverting back to the sort of partisan attack politics that some people say led up to tragedies like what we saw on Saturday.
For all his talk of unity and change and wanting to think differently, he then goes and appoints JD Vance, which tells you an awful lot about Donald Trump, I think, and where he wants the party to go. And he wants a mini-me.
Donald Trump wanted someone that he got along with, that he just enjoyed being with.
Even though this guy called him, possibly as bad as Adolf Hitler and all that stuff.
People totally misunderstand that Donald Trump's a forgiver. Not a forgetter.
Give me a break.
Oh, absolutely.
Donald Trump is a forgiver.
100%.
If you grovel enough.
Hello and welcome to this very first edition of the American Forecast. Now, when we announced the election year of 2024, we always thought it was going to be absolutely consequential for the future of this country. But we didn't imagine that there'd be an assassination attempt, as there was last Saturday, against Donald J. Trump. We didn't imagine that he would survive something like that by the width of an earlobe. We then didn't really imagine that he would call upon his vice presidential candidate, JD Vance, one of the most abrasive and ideological MAGA politicians in the Republican Party. And of course, we didn't really imagine at the same time that the Democrats under President Joe Biden would be forming a circular firing squad in trying to decide the future of their candidate just a few weeks before they have their convention down the road here in Chicago. So there's an awful lot at stake. There's an awful lot to discuss. I have three guests this afternoon to do so. Cassie Smedley, former RNC spokesperson and an RNC Republican strategist. Azzy Pabra from the Washington Post, he's their national reporter. And of course, our very own Siobhan Kennedy, our Washington correspondent. Okay, so Saturday.
It is hard to fully grasp historical moments exactly when they're happening, but I think the image of Donald Trump raising his fist, blood on his face, as the people who are charged with protecting his life are trying to usher him off stage, and the crowd's reaction, I think people immediately grasped that something transformational had occurred, if not in the imagery of American politics and what is happening, then perhaps even more substantively.
Cassie, that image of him, with his fist clenched, rising above his Secret Service detail with the American flag uncannily, poised behind him, reminded me of a human incarnation of that famous sculpture of Iwo Jima, at Arlington.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it was an incredibly powerful image, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think it was immediately iconic. It's the Iwo Jima, and then you think after 9/11 with the firefighters that were kind of recreating the Iwo Jima, or 9/11 with the bullhorn. And then as somebody else said, that we had that moment without having to suffer the sorrow, I guess, of it that normally
That's
comes
a good
with
point,
those
isn't
moments.
it? Yeah. But it's amazing, isn't it, how quickly we talk about the imagery that has resulted from it, and how quickly we channel all this through the prism of the election campaign, and does it put him up a few percentage points or not? But actually, we're talking about dodging by the width of an earlobe a massive tragedy with potentially disastrous consequences.
Which is exactly what he's thinking about now, isn't he? You've heard him say in the last few days, if I had just turned my head, the fact that he was pointing to the board on immigration. I saw a brilliant graphic today that somehow digitized the turn of his head, and had he not made that turn, the bullet went straight through his head. And I think we're really seeing him digesting that, aren't we, in these first few days of the convention, and this immediate talk of unity that he is coming out with, because he really has felt that brush with death, and I think it has changed him.
And it's sort of fascinating, as narrowly as he avoided this kind of tragedy, for years, people who have been complaining about the polarization in the United States, the delirious impact, the delirious impact of the internet and the information ecosystems, people have at least I've sort of wondered what would happen if, God forbid, a tragedy happened along partisan lines in this kind of climate. Would people rally together as they did after 9/11, as they did after other tragedies before that? And what you're seeing today, on some level, are some responsible leaders in both parties saying, let's tone down the rhetoric. But what you're seeing also, if you talk to people here at the convention, look at the merchandise, and look at some of the more outspoken people who have been on the stage, they're immediately reverting back to the sort of partisan attack politics that some people say led up to tragedies like what we saw on Saturday.
But I think I would say I disagree with that a little bit. It's more of the traditional attack politics. It's not what it has elevated to in recent years, where you're saying, basement Joe Biden. You have not heard that this week. And even Donald Trump himself,
Actually,
and time will tell tomorrow.
Oh,
did someone say, I missed that one.
Speech,
But point being that it does feel a little more, we're talking about the policies, and they made a point, the campaign made a point of saying that. We can attack policies all day long because the American people are attacking the policies all day long. But will he be the leader and the healer in chief on this issue? Because I do think that that's where people will take their cue from. I mean, if he can go up there and give this very statesman speech that takes down the tone, and to your point, being in the convention hall at night and you look up and see him in the box, and when people refer to him, there is a little difference in his face.
I think that, I think on Monday he looked really quite shocked still, as you would be, right? He has just defied death. He walked in on Monday, he looked a bit shocked. But what I find so fascinating is that on one hand, we've changed the speeches, we've ripped up that robust speech, and yet it's fight, fight, fight all the way. That's the rallying cry. So there's a sort of chasm between the clenched fist and shouting fight and then trying to be Mr. Nice Guy. Cassie, when that awful event occurred and when he, with incredible luck, survived it, and that image emerged at the same time, did Republicans think, this is over, this election? This is over. We've got an incredibly powerful image here that they can't compete with.
Yeah.
Did you think that?
I did not, because
not.
I've been in this business long enough to know that news cycles are short. But
this is more than a news cycle. This is an iconic image, isn't it?
I understand your point, and that's how you think it would be, but we've had it enough. But it's interesting, my phone, I had people coming into my phone saying that. Trump by 1 million. This is over. This is a landslide. And the response is, you need to show up to work tomorrow. We still have a job to do.
Yeah.
We still have work to be done. And because we can't take this for granted, because even, I know I just said we're not saying it anymore, but 2020 Biden in the basement, everyone thought, how does this guy win? There's not a chance. He's not out there. He's not engaging. Trump did rallies. And he won. You still have to show up and do the work.
What happened on Saturday, as awful as it was, and I think everyone is grateful that he is in as good a shape as he is right now. Before that, the idea was the more people see Trump, the better it is for Democrats. That had been the idea. That had been when he got deplatformed from Twitter and Facebook, when he was starting his own Truth Social network, and the general public wasn't seeing him every day, weren't seeing his tweets, weren't seeing the all caps thing.
Such a good point.
People were able to, it's hard to believe, think about him less.
Yeah.
And what happened on Saturday politically allows him to be the center of attention in a way that doesn't accrue to the benefit of Democrats. If we're just talking about the political analysis of
And that's really important, isn't it? Because there is suddenly, whether you like the guy or not, there is suddenly a sympathy factor that comes into it.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to the next big event, the announcement of JD Vance. Vance. Do you say Vance or do you say Vance?
I say Vance. I'm a
Vance.
Midwesterner.
Okay.
Flat A's.
Okay, we say Vance. Anyway,
I like that.
Senator Vance, the author of the best-selling book Hillbilly Elegy, which is a fabulous book, who's had an incredible journey from, grinding white poverty. Now he's going to be, if they win, the vice president. I know he was tipped as the favorite, but still there was a sharp intake of breath when he got that nod. Why? What's so special about Vance?
Well, first of all, he's of my generation. He's a millennial nominee, which is wild. So when you're talking about, to just the conversation we were having of the optics of, let's face it, two older men facing each other and just trying to find energy from one of them. Now you get JD Vance, the up-and-comer. You get, he's an America First guy.
Yeah.
Heard it report. I think a lot of people have publicly reported this, but heard this in circles as well. Donald Trump wanted someone that he got along with, that he just enjoyed being with. He checks that box.
Even though this guy called him, as possibly as bad as Adolf Hitler and all that stuff.
People totally misunderstand that Donald Trump's a forgiver. He's not
What?
a forgetter,
Give
but
me
he's a
a
forgiver.
break.
Oh, absolutely.
Wait,
last night. 100%.
If you grovel enough.
Yeah.
Because it shows that his critics were wrong. It is.
Good point.
You agree
It is
with Cassie.
not that the calculated thing that it is that it shows if you didn't like me before, you have permission to like me now. And I think that's part of what.
And
But
that's
you've
okay.
got to go through the process of kissing the ring and saying sorry and
No,
going,
but if you come back around, but here's the other thing. You want to talk about Hillbilly Elegy. So I was out in Wisconsin the night of the 2016 election. And I was in a room where It was the now what we would call MAGA crowd. But there were still many people who were surprised. I remember getting on a plane, several members, your colleagues in the press, and people saying, what did we miss? How did we miss this? How did he win? And what did they start reading? Hillbilly Elegy. And there is that part where he fundamentally understands what all of these people went through, because he went through it himself, of what we now call MAGA and MAGA. And there's a lot that they have in common in being able to relate to that.
If you go back and listen to his interviews from 2015, 2016, before he becomes a Senate candidate, before he becomes the person that Donald Trump elevates and gets across the finish line in a very crowded Republican primary, if you go back and listen to those interviews, he is tasked with explaining white working class resentment. And listening to that stuff now, you can hear the seeds of where he ends up. It is, and it's also hard not to think about how other people in the United States who do not look like JD Vance, who are not white, who do not get the benefit of having their authors highlighted and presented, and then having those perspectives seen as like political insight. Like people in majority black communities, Hispanic communities, they have had people describing similar struggles that their under-resourced communities have, and yet those lawmakers, those senators, do not get embraced in the kind of way that JD Vance did by some in the media, and had that kind of rise.
And it was so interesting, wasn't it? Because on Monday night, the head of the Teamsters Union, was speaking at the convention here. This is not the kind of guy, this iconic union leader who shows up at a Republican National Convention. So my question to you is, do you think the Republicans, not all of them, but people like JD Vance, are thinking harder about the plight of poor Americans than many Democrats are?
Well, first of all, I heard an interview earlier in the day on Monday where that same man, the head of the Teamsters, was asked, are you going to Chicago? And he said, I have not been contacted by the Democrats to come to Chicago. And that's how he left it. He's like, I'm a Democrat. Of course I want success for that party, but I have not been contacted. And one thing we know for a long time, the members of these unions versus their leaders are having two different conversations. The boardroom conversation, the kitchen table conversation, are very different, and they have felt neglected. But so, point being, it's not, this is where Donald Trump, the blue collar billionaire, he should not be the one that relates the most to blue collar workers, but he is, and it's because he says, listen, I've done everything I need to do and more in my life. You feeling left out, you're feeling silenced, you're feeling not, I'll be the guy that listens to you.
But there's an evolution here, because I remember, covering the first Trump campaign in 2016, and he was very, very good at channeling the rage of people who felt left behind. I remember someone said, he's an, I won't use the word, it's a rude word, it's a family podcast. He's an A something, but at least he's our, right? I wonder if the Republican Party is beginning to evolve, and actually not just channeling the rage, but thinking about how to improve the plight of poor people in this country. Has it? Or is that being too generous?
Unless there's a wholesale change in policy, it's hard to see it. But there are possible policy changes that they adopt in terms of, they're avoiding the word abortion. But there have been people who've said, let's make it less expensive to raise a family with raising certain elements of the social safety net. That is something that Democrats have broadly tried to seek, and if Republicans are seeing a blowback to repealing abortion rights, if this is one of their ways that they say, look, let's not change any more laws because there's a political consequence to it, but let's try to do something. It is possible, but it is done for arguably other reasons. Democrats have had a longer history of supporting policies that impact and benefit people who are lower income.
A longer history, but I have to say this has been a sea change, and that is why you're hearing the Everyday Americans at this convention. We just heard from one woman, I wish I had her name, but she's a New Yorker, and she very wholeheartedly said, the Democrat Party left me. She's a black woman, New Yorker, grew up Democrat, had no idea a Republican existed in real life, and she's a Republican and proud supporter of Donald Trump, and it is because the Democrat Party has rested on its laurels of being the party of the working class and the poor community, and that has not matched up in their policies. And then it was Donald Trump, first administration. We can talk about a lot of things, and a lot of things have to improve. I worked on Capitol Hill. You wish it could all be better. But it was Donald Trump that did criminal justice reform. It was Donald Trump that worked on paid family leave and got it through. These are things that you never expected a Republican administration to be championing, and he did use that time when he had majorities in Congress to effectively do it, and Democrats have not in the same way, and they now look like the party of the country club.
But there was also tax reform in the first Trump administration that helped,
very much
helped
helped
rather
the rich.
well-heeled people.
I think definitely his pick of Vance is about him wanting to be seen to be appealing to working class people more. And he even said that in his statement, didn't he? This is the man, he mentioned the book in the first paragraph, this is the man who's going to help me. He knows these people who are my base inside out. That's why he wants him to increase his votes in that base.
But apparently he didn't want to pick Vance at first, right? So it was Donald Jr.
wanted him
who's
to
a
pick.
mate of Vance's, to persuade a dad to pick Vance. Is that true?
And Elon Musk and others. I mean, Vance is very popular with a lot of people. And Tucker Carlson.
They all wanted Vance,
Yes,
but Dad didn't. Well, Donald Trump did not want Vance at first, I'm told. Didn't dismiss him, but Vance, there were other people he preferred.
And who will not certify an election that I call fraud?
Right,
like,
that's
let's
the
not,
most important stuff.
Like, let's not overlook his litmus test. Everyone that has been presented and elevated at this convention, it is not their policy specifically.
It's that they believe in the big lie.
They
or the big steal, as they would like to call it.
They believe in Donald Trump. They are right with him and everything that follows after that. The Republicans who do not support Donald Trump, you don't see them here. You don't see former sitting presidents, former Republican presidential nominees. They are not here because they do not like Donald Trump.
Mitt
they do
Romney,
not agree with him.
Liz Cheney, Paul Ryan,
For
none
all,
of them here.
for all his talk of unity and change and wanting to think differently, he then goes and appoints JD Vance, which tells you an awful lot about Donald Trump, I think, and where he wants the party to go. He wants a mini-me, and he wants someone who is going to be a MAGA attack
Vance
dog.
is slightly taller than Donald Trump, and normally that bothers
with facial hair. But he wants a mini-me, someone who's going to basically do what he says.
Okay, but will he? I mean, look at Vance. He's smart.
Well, he is
he's
so
tall. He's a former Marine. He was a venture capitalist. He knows. He ticks so many different boxes. I wonder if you've got. And you used to have a guy called Mike Pence, who's basically got the charisma of a pot plant, right? Now you've got JD Vance. Is Trump asking for trouble?
No, but Vance, crucially, if when he was asked what would you have done if you were Pence, he said he wouldn't have certified the election. I mean, ultimately.
Yeah, but is he going to overshadow the boss? Is he smarter than the boss? Is he more charismatic than the boss? Or does that?
I don't think Trump would let that happen.
No, I think there are more charismatic people who aren't there, but also Donald Trump has 4 more years. And so for this not to be just a lame duck term.
If he gets elected.
But if it's not to be a lame duck term, you've got to have somebody in there who's going to help cement your legacy and your platform of America First, and JD Vance fits into that.
And typically, the next presidential election begins the day after the last one. But right now, everyone is sort of competing for one vote, and that's Donald Trump's in terms of who succeeds him later on.
So let me ask you this question, Cassie. We talked a little bit about how Trump might have been changed by his near-death experience. Do you think that one of the things that might have persuaded him to go for Vance is that he's thinking about the future beyond himself? He's thinking about his legacy. It's not just about the here and now.
Yes, absolutely.
He wants to cement the MAGA legacy for the next generation.
Yes, it's America First policies. And by the way, guys, we can talk all day long about why isn't Mitt Romney here? Why isn't Paul Ryan here? And I love those people too. I was at their convention. But today's Republican Party wants to see the fighter, hopefully happy warrior of Donald Trump looking out for the forgotten man and woman in America. I'm from flyover country. I know what it is to have your state flown over and forgotten and then move out to Washington, D.C. and have people talk about, I'm sorry, where is that again? People only know my hometown, Kansas City, Missouri. People only know it because Travis Kelce dated Taylor Swift. Literally, I had people be like, I had no idea where it was on the map. And
so you really feel that sort of
1000%.
that arrogance, that condescension towards people from the so-called flyover country?
Absolutely. And by the way, the fact that you had all these reporters grasping to get their hands on Hillbilly Elegy to say, what's this part of the world? What's this part of the country? That's real because there's not enough curiosity to go and say, well, what else is happening in our country that's not happening on the coast, that's not happening in the big metropolis? And there's a whole lot happening, and their industries have gone away, their wages have gone down. Let me just posit one other thing. When I worked for a congressman from Wisconsin, we did polling. I never forgot it. In this polling, they said, what's your number one concern of women? What's your number one concern? that I have moved to this town in middle northern Wisconsin, and I love it. It was a great place to raise a family. My kids go off to college and they cannot come back here to raise their own family because there's no industry for them.
Yeah.
There's no life for them. So they have to move to these metropolises, which is breaking apart our family. That has been a real concern. I mean, that was 2013, and it still resonates. So to dismiss this out of hand and say you're talking about people sucking it up to stealing the election or whatever, no, you are missing the point of why people
stealing the election or whatever. Politely is not something to just look over him.
No, I get the democracy, but I have to push back here.
Yeah.
4 years ago, interest rates were 3%. I could go to the grocery store and buy for my family a four for about $150. It's not a different. It is the issue.
Yeah, but inflation may be the issue, but you cannot. I'm sorry, you cannot just kick the monopoly board when you've lost the game. I mean, that's what Trump tried to do. He lost the election, fair and square, and didn't accept it. But for me, I don't know about
but
you.
again,
for
why
me,
he's
as someone who
back
lives
in
in
the
a democracy, that is a fundamental error.
I hear you, but why is Donald Trump back
mistake.
to being this party's nominee? It is not because of the allure of the guy on Donald Trump who understands TV. It is because people are saying, my life was better 4 years ago. Yeah, I know who was in office 4 years ago, and I'm willing to forgive the mean tweets or the things that I don't love about him personality-wise if he can bring back in something that helps me and my family.
But what happens if he loses again, right? What are they going to do again? Are they going to call for another insurrection? Is he going to send JD Vance to Capitol Hill again? I mean, if you don't accept the rules of the game in a nation that is bitterly divided, 50-50, and where the election itself is decided by a slither of 100,000 people in 3 swing states, you're asking for a world of trouble.
Of course, their answer is, we'll accept it if it's free and fair. But I mean, discuss.
Exactly. But to your point about like the economic anxiety, in that people feel like something is lost. They feel like cities aren't working. They feel like their towns aren't working. There was an implied social contract. You raise your family, you pay your taxes, your kids can get educated and come back and have choices that you may not have had. And the fact that the jobs are not where families wanted them to be, that Elon Musk just announced he's moving office from California to Texas. There is something about geography in America and politics that is very, I think, complicated for people to like fully appreciate. Growing up in New York, I grew up in the same county as Donald Trump where he started, Queens. Yeah. And you looked at Manhattan and you thought
You're a bridge and tunnel boy.
Those people don't understand me. I'm on the outside, and that's something that sort of carries with you going forward. What's unusual about Donald Trump is that he started with a very rich family, but culturally he felt excluded, and he's tapped into this kind of resentment. Now, does that lead him to support better policy? Debatable, but when he communicates, he is tapping into what people who grew up in Missouri and other places say. This is what I feel. And when I go to the supermarket, the price, now I'm noticing this price, and it's tapping into something, and I have now a narrative about who's to blame and what I can do about it.
I totally understand why people are upset about inflation. They are in our country as well. We've just had an election that was partly lost by the Tory party, partly because of inflation. But there's a difference between the social and economic woes you tackle and accepting the fundamental rules of the election. And I bet you he said, January the 6th wasn't about, I haven't finished my work for the American people. It was about, I should be in the White House and I'm not, and I'm really upset about it.
And this is a guy who rose to prominence, by the birtherism lie about Barack Obama, which was incredibly racist, and saying horrible things about people from Mexico, and he continues this kind of lie about people emptying their jail cells and sending them here, when in fact it's if you look at the research and a recent book, by a staff writer at the New Yorker, it's actually kind of the opposite. So he taps into a kind of racial resentment.
Cassie, what do you think of that? That's quite an accusation that we're leveling against, Donald Trump.
My one big thing, and I'm with you on the democracy stuff, but if people were feeling okay about the direction of this country, all of that you're talking about Donald Trump, all he's done, all he hasn't done, all he said, all he hasn't said, and yet here he is back at the head of this party, getting ready to accept the nomination for the 3rd time. It's only possible because the things that we face in our everyday lives are not going well right now. And uniquely, we have this opportunity where politicians in the past, we've all heard it, Mitt Romney comes in and he says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to forecast. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I will do if you give me this opportunity. Donald Trump said, this is what I did and I will do it again if you give me this opportunity. And Americans have a long enough memory to say, you know what? I did enjoy it when my gas was $1.67 a gallon and not between $3 and $4 or more.
I still think that this is untested. Everything you're saying applies to the Republican Party. It's still untested and unclear how well, obviously, he will do in a general election with voters sitting on the fence. Okay. Not clear, and it's not clear to me that. And the JD Vance pick there, it's not clear to me that he could end up regretting that. He could, because look what happened in the midterms. I mean, all those picks of his, the extreme MAGA picks, were not popular and didn't do well for the party. And everyone seems to have forgotten that. That was only 2 years ago. He has saddled himself with a running mate who, to a lot of people, will be distasteful. And for people sitting on the fence, JD Vance might be the thing that makes them hold their nose and stick with Biden.
I mean, it's amazing how in this convention week, the word you rarely hear, other than as a kind of badge of honor, is felon. He is a convicted felon. Now, whether you like the New York case or not, he was convicted by a jury of his peers. He's a convict who's going to end up in the White House. Well, I mean,
convicted by a jury of his peers in New York City.
Yeah, but so it's still a jury of his peers.
Yeah, but that was happened, as they say, on jury selection.
Can I just say,
wait. For someone who just complained about flyover country and the resentment, to then say that the city where this guy grew up doesn't have people who are his peers, that itself is a kind of, it's just the other side of the coin.
Yeah, but you heard a lot last night about Alvin Bragg and the DAs. There was no reason this case should have ever been brought. And now you have people, this is another thing though.
This is a guy who said lock her up about Hillary Clinton when there was no case against her.
And then he said, I won't lock her up. I don't know, there's no case against her.
But isn't the problem here? You've got a guy who didn't accept the result of an election that he lost. Right? And obviously he's blowing in the winds now. This is all Donald Trump, right? This is the Trump breeze.
It's a sign.
He didn't accept the election that he lost, and he doesn't accept, and his followers don't accept the rule of law as applied to him. That is a dangerous thing for a country that is based on the rule of law, is it not?
I'm not going to sit here and talk about democracy and rule of law. I'm with you that democracy is very important.
It's a very important issue, though.
Yeah, a very important issue, and I think the vast majority of people accept the results and accept that we need to have free and fair elections and accept them. We also need to have secure borders. That's a fundamental right of any country. We don't have that right now.
Yeah.
We also people need to feel like they can have a job and support their family. And my point to you, it is not that people are saying it doesn't matter. It is just that when you talk about it in an outsized way, as so many media outlets do around here, people are saying, I get it, I got it. I'm exhausted by that because I'm exhausted by everything else that is stressing me out in my life right now.
Yeah. The other thing that's not come up at all is the Supreme Court ruling a few weeks ago regarding the immunity of a president, whether he's called Biden or Trump or something else. I mean, to us in good old Europe, that was like a real shocker. I mean, everyone's supposed to be equal before the law, no one's above the law, but this ruling, if you look at it, it effectively says that if you do something as president, even if it's killing an opponent, I'm not suggesting that he would, but even if it is that, motive doesn't come into it and you can get away with it, basically. We cannot take you to court over this action. Now, and that of course sets a signal from the highest court to courts beneath that as well. So this is a really tricky thing. Are you worried about it?
I think there are people who have looked at this very closely that are very worried about it, including the people who had worked for Richard Nixon, who very famously said after he resigned from office, if a president did it, it's not illegal. Years later, a Supreme Court that Donald Trump helped fill a number of vacancies affirmed that view, which I think has shocked a lot of people.
Cassie, does it shock you?
Guardrails around this sort of thing are very important. If it's and again, I haven't looked at this very closely, but it's my recollection that what they were talking about is if it was done in the service of the office of the presidency. And that's what they determine. And have you seen, obviously, the follow-on to this is just before coming here, you had the Jack Smith case thrown out.
Yeah.
And that was huge.
This is the documents case in Florida,
And some thought that it was because of this case in the Supreme Court that was predetermining that Garland never had the constitutional ability to appoint Jack Smith. That was where this all broke down, which is very interesting how we're already seeing potentially these decisions play out in the justice system, but where there are a lot of people who feel that our justice system has become so politicized that they would say this is a good thing to have this check.
The Democrats, they keep saying that democracy's on the line. This is the most existential election ever, and yet here is Biden. Half the party wants him to go. The other party is saying, well, you might as well stay. Zimmer framing his way to November the 5th. How selfish is he being by being the bed blocker in chief? Cassie, you first.
Well, you do hear that from folks who are. This is Joe Biden. He is saying, I'm not going to move, and the more you make it personal about me moving, the more I'm going to dig in. I deserve to be here.
And they dig in their heels, right?
But you know what? The Democrats, and listen, I understand when you have an incumbent, typically you don't have a traditional primary process. So I'm not going to sit here and say they didn't have a primary process, this is what they get. However, the polls were showing that you had people who were polling in mid 20% range that said, should we be taking a closer look at what our party wants from us? And so I'm in this position now of, you made your bed, you need to lie in it. You didn't have the tough conversation with Joe Biden when your voters were desperately asking you to, so now you deal with it.
Azzy?
He relied on a surprisingly strong Democratic showing in the midterm elections, and I think that helped pave the way to where we are today. And he has not given great answers in some of these interviews after the debate, and for a lot of Americans, they saw the debate, they saw Pennsylvania, and November is speeding up ahead a lot faster than many people expect.
Okay.
You mean they saw Pennsylvania, the assassination attempt, and thought that's it, it's a done deal?
Or just the contrast between the two.
Momentum, yeah, and the contrast.
It is surprising to think that it is Republicans who are so united and it is Democrats who are so divided. If you if you look back in January and February, that is not where people would have.
Conventions would be the exact
completely,
opposite
yeah.
way
And of
around.
course we have the shadow of 1968, the Democrat convention that went horribly wrong, which they don't want to repeat. So the final prediction is Biden going to be on the ticket, Siobhan?
Yes,
He will be. Okay.
I think so.
All right.
I don't see how they undo it now.
Azzy?
Stay tuned. I mean, I don't know, but when when President Biden keeps saying that he's running, and other Democrats keep saying, consider it, they're implying that he has not given a final answer, even though he says he has.
Cassie?
You
want him to be on the ticket, don't you?
Well, yes, but I think he's going to be on. But the reason being, if they felt so confident that Kamala Harris, because I do think the other option has to be Kamala Harris. I don't think they can suffer the optics of skipping over her. And if they thought that she was such a viable option, they would have been able to get Joe Biden to step aside. They really would have sent in absolutely everybody and done it. And I think the fact that they're like, we don't really have any great option or alternative says, let's just go with Joe Biden, because overall, the polls are holding
Exactly.
pretty
All this
steady.
talk, they are still neck and
Well,
neck.
let's see how they feel, when is it? In a month's time, less than a month's time in Chicago.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the election in 15 weeks' time. Well, that was pretty lively stuff for the first American forecast from here in Wisconsin at the Republican National Convention. Thanks to all of you. See you next time.